Today we're going to talk about the legislative process, how a bill becomes a law. We're going to use a chart that's put out by the California Assembly Rules Committee called the Life Cycle of Legislation. You can usually pick up copies of this chart from your legislator's office. It's a very helpful chart to help understand the process of how a bill becomes law in the state of California. So, part of the process is when it gets introduced into the legislature. But it actually starts before that, before it actually gets announced, before it gets into print. And that can happen in a couple of different ways. Sometimes a legislator has an idea of how a bill should be written, that we need a new law to address a certain issue. And so he himself comes up with the idea and gets some help to write up a draft of that bill. But other times, it is other individuals that come up with an idea, and then they have to get a legislator to agree with them that this is a bill that should be introduced. Now, the reason for that is because only a legislator in California can introduce a bill in the state legislature. An average citizen can't just introduce a bill to the legislature and ask them to vote on it. It has to be an actual elected representative of the people. It has to be one of the 40 state senators or 80 assembly members that are elected into our legislature in California. It can't be even the governor. The governor, if he has a bill idea, he has to get a legislator to put forward his bill idea for him. He has to get someone else to be convinced that that bill should move forward. So it has to be a legislator that introduces the bill. So whoever comes up with the idea, the next step after the drafting of the bill is for Leg Counsel to look at the bill. And the Leg Counsel, or Legislative Counsel, is a group of attorneys whose job is to be the legal helpers for the legislators. They're the attorneys that work for the legislators that help them write the law in California. Now, there are varying attorneys within Leg Counsel that have varying expertise, and they assign various bills or various ideas to those people with the expertise in that area. So Leg Counsel will take a draft of a bill or even just an idea, and they'll write the actual wording for how that bill would then be written for going into the code. So that first version of the bill, as worded by Leg Counsel, is then taken by the legislator, and he goes down to the floor. Now, the floor in the legislature is the room where all of the members of his house gather to vote on bills. Now, the floor in the assembly is called the assembly floor, and that's where the 80 assembly members gather to vote on bills. And the Senate floor is where the 40 senators gather together to vote on bills. Now, each of those rooms, they're called the floor of the Senate and the floor of the assembly. Each of those rooms has a desk along the front of it. And when a legislator wants to introduce a bill, he gets the wording through Leg Counsel, and then he takes it in that room to the floor, and he puts it across the desk and hands it to the person behind the desk, the secretary that works back there. And that process is called putting it across the desk. That's when a bill is officially introduced. That's when it's officially submitted. That's when it has officially entered the process, the legislative process of becoming a law in California. Now, after the bill goes across the desk, it gets assigned a bill number. Now, bill numbers come from the person behind the desk working to assign it a number based on when it was introduced. So bills are introduced and they're given a number based on, they're given numbers in order. From the first bill being introduced is the number 1. and 2, and then 3. So they're introduced and in order, whichever order that bill was handed across the desk in, whichever number that was is the number that gets stamped on the bill. But before the number itself, there is an AB or an SB. Now in California, we have the Assembly and we have the Senate. So Assembly bills say AB for Assembly bill. AB1 is the first bill that's put across the desk in the Assembly. AB2 is the second bill that's put across the desk in the Assembly, and so on and so forth. In the Senate, SB1 is the first bill put across the desk in the Senate. SB2 is the second bill put across the desk in the Senate, and so on. So you have Senate bills and you have Assembly bills. Overall, there's about 6,000 bills introduced in a 2-year session in California, approximately 3,000 bills per year in the California state legislature. So you have 120 legislators introducing bills. That's an average of about 25 bills per legislator per year. That's a lot of bills. So as those get introduced, they go across the desk, they get assigned bill numbers, then they get sent straight to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is where those bills get assigned to policy committees and fiscal committees. Policy committees are like your Education Committee, your Agriculture Committee, your Tax Committee, your Judiciary Committee, the committees that determine if this policy that's in this bill is the kind of policy we want to adopt in California. Then the fiscal committees are the committees where bills go to determine whether we have the money to spend on those bills or not. It has to do with, do we want to pay for this policy? The job of a fiscal committee is not to determine whether this is good policy for California. It is the job of a fiscal committee to determine whether or not we want to pay for it, to implement it. So the policy committees determine policy, the fiscal committees determine the finances. So as the Rules Committee determines what committees it needs to go to, they need to take into account what this bill is going to impact. If it impacts education, it should go through the Education Committee. If it's going to impact healthcare, then it goes through the Health Committee. If it's going to impact our judiciary system, then it should go through the Judiciary Committee. If it's going to impact farms, it's got to go through the committee that deals with that, which is the Agriculture Committee. So you're going to have to make sure, if you're going to introduce a bill, that you are going to follow that bill all the way through. And so when you are looking at a bill from the outside of this process and looking at where it's getting assigned, you want to be watching each one of these stops along the way, because each one of them is a place where that bill is going to be voted on. It's also a place where that bill has potential to be amended or changed. But it's also another place to think about that this is an opportunity for this bill to die, because it has to be voted on, it has to get passed in order to move forward. So each stop along the legislative process, each time the bill gets voted on, is an opportunity for that bill to die. So the Rules Committee determines which committees the bill goes to, and then once the bill goes to its first policy committee, then that policy committee, which has its own staff members that help evaluate each of the bills in that committee, that staff member that's assigned to the committee, they write an analysis on the bill. They work with the author's office to determine what the priorities are in the bill, what the purpose of the bill is, and perhaps, because they are working for that committee, say it's an education committee and an education staff member, it is their area of expertise. And so they might have suggestions for amendments to that bill. So they need to work with the author's office, the author's staff, to try to figure out how they can come to an agreement on the wording of that bill and some suggested amendments to it. Then they can set a hearing date. Prior to the hearing date, that analysis is getting formulated. They're figuring out what they're going to recommend. The staff member works for the committee, so they're going to write up a bunch of things about this bill and tell the committee members what the staff member thinks of the bill, what they think they should change in the bill, and how they think that the committee members should vote on the bill. Now, this is huge. The legislative staff working for the committee takes input from organizations and individuals. And if you're able to send in a letter explaining well enough the reasons why you think the bill should be changed, they may take that into consideration as well. And they may even use your letter in their analysis and quote from it and explain that your view is that you think this part of the bill should be changed, and so they might include that in their recommendations to the committee. It can have a profound effect. But it varies from one committee to the next and one staff member to the next. You never know how somebody's going to come down on your position unless you perhaps know the people ahead of time. That's one of the things that's really important about building relationships with staff at the Capitol, is that if I have a relationship with a staff member in one committee, I'm going to go to them and talk to them about a bill before it even gets to that committee, so that I know when it gets there, I can work with that person, that I have built a relationship prior to that, and work together with them on concerns that I have with the bill. Once the analysis has been written, and then perhaps the bill comes up in that committee for a vote, the author of the bill presents the bill in committee, explains why he wants to move the bill forward, why he wants the bill to be passed and become law, what the need is for the bill, what caused him to pursue it in the first place. Then the committee might ask questions. There might be some debate among the legislators. There might be people coming in from the outside that say, I support this bill or I oppose this bill. They might have arguments for or against the bill. And then the committee votes on the bill. The committee may vote on the bill as it was presented to them, or the committee may suggest, we're going to suggest amending the bill, and they might vote on the bill including their proposed amendments. Amendments can happen just right there in the middle of a committee hearing, and they might even vote on an idea without even having the wording in place, in which case they would come up with the wording later, but the vote is binding. So they move forward. They might send the bill out of committee either as it was or with an amendment coming very soon afterwards. So once the bill comes out of that committee, then it needs to go to its next committee, and perhaps there might be 2 or 3 committees before it goes to a fiscal committee. Then in the fiscal committee, the same thing happens. The author presents the bill. There might be discussion, and then there's a vote. After that, it's gone through policy committees, it's gone through fiscal committees, then it goes to the floor. All the members of that house vote on the bill. So if it's a Senate bill, SB1, SB1 has gone through the Education Committee, it's gone through the Fiscal Committee or the Appropriations Committee, and then SB1 has gone to where? It goes to the floor in its house. If it's an SB, that means it's a Senate bill, so the first floor it goes to is the Senate floor, because it's an SB. It's still in its house of origin where it started, the Senate. So it's on the Senate floor, goes to a vote there. Then if it passes the Senate floor, it goes over to the Assembly, because every bill that gets introduced has to go through both houses and be approved by both houses before it can go to the governor to be signed into law. So SB1 goes through it goes through the Education Committee, goes through the Appropriations Committee, then it goes through the floor. If it gets passed on the floor, then it goes all the way to the Assembly. Then in the Assembly, it's got to go to Rules Committee. The Rules Committee, again, decides which committees it goes to. It goes to some policy committees, and then perhaps to a fiscal committee or the Appropriations Committee. So SB1 is now in the Assembly. It has to go through its committees again. Then it has to go to the Assembly floor. After it gets voted on the Assembly floor, then it goes to the governor. Except wait, there's one more question you have to ask at that point. did this bill get amended in the second house? If it got amended in the first house, in the Senate, then the Senate has approved the bill. And then as it goes through the assembly, if the assembly approves that same version of the bill, then it goes straight to the governor after it gets voted on the floor of the assembly. But as a bill goes through the Senate, it might get amended. And then it gets voted on the floor and sent over to the assembly, which would be fine, except that if it gets amended in the assembly, and then the assembly votes on the floor on that version that they changed in the assembly, they have to then send it back over to the Senate to say, hey, we changed this bill. Do you still agree with it? And this is called concurrence. The assembly, if they've changed a bill, they have to have Senate concurrence before it can go to the governor, which means that both houses have to agree to the final version of the bill before it goes to the governor. Now, sometimes a bill will go back and forth several times between the two houses before it gets a final approval and goes over to the governor. But ultimately, when a bill goes to the governor's got one version of it that's been approved by both houses. And that version is the one that he looks at to decide whether he wants to sign it or veto it. Now, the governor signs a lot of bills, and he vetoes a few bills too. But there's a lot of bills that become law in California. But there's three options that the California governor has. He can sign a bill and make it law. He can veto a bill and it dies and does not become law. Or he can put it in his pocket. Now, at the federal level, if a bill gets to the president and he puts it in his pocket, it's called a pocket veto. In California, we don't have that. We have something else. It's kind of the opposite. If the governor puts a bill in his pocket here in California, in other words, if he doesn't do anything with it, then it automatically becomes law. That doesn't happen much in California. Primarily, we just have to deal with the signed bills and the vetoed bills. So the governor has a lot of power at the end of the day over whether a bill becomes law or not. He has absolute authority to just veto the bill. Now, his veto can be overridden by a 2/3 majority of the legislature, but that doesn't happen much either. It's pretty much what the governor says goes. If he's vetoing a bill, it dies. Every once in a while, you'll see there's some back and forth between the governor and the legislature over a bill. And they'll have conversations about trying to work out the bill details before it gets to the governor's office. This happens every year with the budget because the legislature has to propose the budget. The governor proposes an outline, and then the legislature moves through the process, the legislative process, with the budget bill, and they send the governor a budget to sign. And if he doesn't like the budget and doesn't sign it, then they wasted a lot of time working out those details. So they work pretty hard with the governor to work out those details before they send it to his office to make sure that they're all on the same page and they haven't wasted their time. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you have more questions or you'd like to take a look at the chart, I would encourage you to take a look at that and follow along as you see the process go with Assembly bills, Senate bills, and how they go through the process, going from their house of origin to the second house and finally to the governor. There's a lot more details, but this is the basics. So I hope this helps you, and I hope you will make sure that as you understand this process better, and you understand that there are many different opportunities to weigh in on legislation as it's going through the process, that you'll make your voice heard, that you will engage with this process and make sure that your legislator, your assembly member, and your senator hear from you on the bills that you care about. Make sure that they can't get into that committee hearing and say, I haven't heard from any of my constituents about this bill. You don't want them to be able to say that. If it's a bill you care about, make sure they hear from you. That's it for today.